Everyone laughed the day I inherited that hillside. All it had were hundreds of gray, lifeless tree stumps scattered across the slope. People in the valley said the land was ruined, that nothing would ever grow there again. To them, it looked like a graveyard for trees. But 2 years later, something unbelievable happened. The same people who once stood at the bottom of that hill laughing were now standing in the exact same place, asking me for help, begging me for trees. Because what began growing on that dead hillside didn't just change the land, it changed the entire valley. Hello everyone. Before we begin, make sure you join our YouTube family by subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like this video. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Alright, now let's get into the story. I never expected to inherit anything. Life had been ordinary, predictable even, with its small routines and quiet rhythms. But the letter arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon, its envelope thick and slightly yellowed with age. My name was scrawled across it in a familiar hand, the looping cursive of my uncle, who I barely remembered from childhood visits. He had passed away unexpectedly, and with his passing came a surprise I wasn't prepared for. A sprawling piece of land perched on the edge of the valley, described in the letter as a gift of nature's own design. I smiled at the phrase, imagining rolling meadows, wildflowers, maybe a peaceful stream, the kind of place that would seem like paradise in a painting. I had no idea what awaited me. When I arrived at the property, a sharp wind greeted me, carrying the scents of earth and pine, the subtle decay of life, and the whisper of something ancient. The path that led up to the hill was narrow, tangled with roots and rocks, the sort of route that made one feel small and insignificant. But as I crested the rise, my heart sank. The hillside stretched before me, a vast expanse, but it was unlike anything I had envisioned. It wasn't a meadow. It wasn't a forest. It was a graveyard of stumps, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, jagged and gray, jutting out from the earth like broken teeth. Each stump bore its own scars, some weathered and cracked, others freshly cut, the remnants of a life that had been wrenched away. I blinked, unsure whether I should laugh or cry. This was the inheritance, a hillside of stumps. The valley below was dotted with small houses, each with its garden or yard, and it wasn't long before I noticed movement. My neighbors, already aware of my arrival, had gathered to watch. Children pointed, laughing and nudging one another. Men shook their heads, muttering comments under their breath. Women covered their mouths, trying not to let their amusement show. What a waste. One man called out, "Are you going to plant flowers among those things?" Another laughed louder, adding, "Might as well call it a graveyard." Even from the hilltop, I could hear the mocking tone, see the ripples of laughter echoing up from the valley below. I felt a sting, sharper than I expected, as if their amusement were a tangible thing that pressed against my chest. This was not what I had imagined. I had expected gratitude, maybe curiosity, perhaps even a spark of excitement. Instead, there was ridicule, a chorus of disbelief at my inheritance. At first, I considered leaving. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps this land was nothing but broken dreams and useless wood. But then, as I stood there, surveying the expanse of stumps, I noticed something peculiar. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it a pulse, a quiet thrum beneath the surface of the earth. The stumps seemed to hum faintly in time with the wind. I bent down, running my hand over the rough bark of one particularly gnarled stump, and I felt warmth. Not much, just a trace, like the last whisper of life lingering stubbornly in wood. I frowned, confused. Was it imagination? Or perhaps some trick of the light? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of moss and soil, and I swore I could hear a faint creak, as if the stump were sighing. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow and small against the vastness of the hillside. But even as I laughed, a seed of curiosity planted itself deep within me. Maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't as dead as it appeared. The first few days were filled with work and observation. I spent hours walking the hillside, examining each stump, noting its size, the way it leaned, the pattern of cracks in the wood. Some stumps were wide and flat, as though they had once been grand trees with sweeping branches. Others were slender, stubborn survivors that had been cut down too soon. I traced my fingers along the growth rings of one stump and felt the weight of its history. Each ring a year, a story, a battle against wind, sun, and time. I imagined the lives these trees had lived, the storms they had weathered, the birds that had nested in their branches, the squirrels that had darted across their limbs. And then I imagined what might come next. If life had once thrived here, could it not thrive again? As the days passed, the valley below continued its scrutiny. Children ran up and down the hillside edges, daring one another to get close. Laughing when their feet slipped over roots and rocks, the adults' comments grew sharper, more biting. "Don't waste your time," one man shouted. "You can't grow anything here." I smiled politely, though inwardly I bristled. There was a stubbornness building inside me, a quiet resolve to prove them wrong. I began small experiments, planting saplings in the few pockets of soil that weren't completely choked by the stumps. I watered them, spoke to them, whispered encouragement in the silence of dawn and dusk. At first, nothing happened. The saplings drooped, leaves yellowed, and I cursed the earth. Yet I refused to give up. There was something beneath the stumps, some hidden resilience, and I was determined to find it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the valley and painted the sky in fiery oranges and pinks, I climbed to the highest point of the hill. I looked down on the valley, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The laughter from below had faded, replaced by curious murmurs. Even from this distance, I could sense their incredulity, their disbelief that anyone could find purpose in this ruined hillside. I took a deep breath, the cold wind biting my cheeks, and I felt a strange sense of camaraderie with the stumps. They had stood here long before me, bearing witness to storms and seasons, and now it was my turn to care for them. I whispered a quiet promise. "We will grow again. You and I together." That night, I slept under a sky heavy with stars, the hillside looming like a gray fortress in the moonlight. I dreamed of forests, dense and vibrant, of leaves brushing together, of birds singing at dawn. I woke with the memory vivid, the dream lingering in my bones. The stumps seemed less ominous in the morning light. There was potential here, hidden beneath the scars of what had been lost. And as the valley began to stir below, their laughter fading into cautious curiosity, I understood something crucial. This inheritance, this hillside of stumps, was not a burden. It was an opportunity, an invitation to see life where others saw only death. And I, with patience and care, was ready to answer it. The first real change on the hillside happened so quietly that no one noticed it at first. Not the people in the valley, not the children who still wandered near the lower slope, and not even me. It began beneath the soil, hidden from sight, where roots that had been sleeping for years slowly stirred awake. I discovered it by accident. One morning, nearly 2 months after I had moved onto the land, I was carrying buckets of water uphill when I slipped on damp earth beside one of the larger stumps. The bucket tipped, soaking the base of the stump completely. Frustrated, I knelt to steady myself, pressing my hand into the mud. That was when I saw it, a tiny green shoot pushing out from the side of the stump itself. At first, I thought it was a weed. The valley was full of stubborn weeds that grew anywhere they pleased. But this shoot was different. Its leaves were small, but perfectly shaped, vibrant green against the dull gray wood. It wasn't growing near the stump. It was growing from it. I leaned closer, heart pounding with sudden excitement. The stump wasn't dead. It was alive. The realization changed everything. Over the next few days, I searched the hillside carefully. Once I knew what to look for, I began spotting more signs, tiny buds swelling along cracked bark, delicate shoots emerging from roots buried just beneath the surface. Some stumps had several sprouts, each reaching upward like hopeful hands. The trees hadn't truly died when they were cut. They had been waiting. That evening, as the valley lights flickered on one by one below, I sat among the stumps and tried to understand what had happened here. Old logging scars were everywhere. Whoever had harvested the forest had taken the trunks but left the root systems intact. Beneath the soil, an entire network still lived, connected and resilient. All they needed was time and help. The next morning, I began working differently. Instead of planting new saplings everywhere, I focused on the stumps themselves. I cleared choking weeds from around them. I loosened compacted soil. I carried water up the hill again and again, until my shoulders burned and my hands blistered. The valley watched. At first, they laughed harder than ever. "He's watering dead wood now," someone shouted one afternoon. A group of teenagers sat on a fence below, clapping sarcastically. Whenever I passed with another bucket, their laughter echoed across the slope. But strangely, it didn't hurt the way it once had. I knew something they didn't. Life was already returning. Weeks passed, and the shoots grew taller. Leaves widened. The dull hillside began to show faint patches of green, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. Birds were the first to notice. Sparrows arrived, hopping between stumps. Then came robins, their songs breaking the morning silence. One sunrise, I spotted a hawk circling overhead, something the valley hadn't seen in years. Nature was responding faster than people. Mrs. Halden, the oldest resident in the valley, became the first to climb the hill. She approached slowly, leaning on a wooden cane, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. "You're not planting trees," she said. "No," I replied. "They're regrowing themselves." She knelt beside a stump and touched the leaves gently. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "We thought they were gone." Word spread quickly after that. Within days, more villagers came to see. Some arrived out of curiosity, others out of disbelief. They walked carefully among the stumps, staring at the growing shoots as if witnessing something impossible. "How long were they like this?" a farmer asked. "Probably since the logging," I answered, and nobody knew. I shook my head. No one looked closely. That sentence lingered in the air long after I said it. As summer deepened, the hillside transformed faster. Shoots thickened into young branches. New leaves cast small shadows across the soil. Grass returned where erosion had once stripped the earth bare. Rain began to soak into the ground instead of rushing downhill in muddy streams. The valley started to change too. The river that often ran brown after storms began flowing clearer. Fields near the base of the hill stayed moist longer. Farmers noticed their crops suffering less from sudden dry spells. One evening, a man named Elias approached me while I worked. "I owe you an apology," he said awkwardly. "We all thought you were wasting your time." I smiled. I wasn't sure myself at first. He looked across the hillside, now dotted with hundreds of young green crowns. "My grandfather used to say this valley was cooler when the forest stood. Summers weren't this harsh." We stood in silence, feeling a breeze drift down the slope cooler than usual, carrying the scent of leaves instead of dust. The changes weren't dramatic yet, but they were undeniable. Autumn arrived with golden light spreading across the valley. The young trees, though still small, turned shades of amber and crimson. For the first time since I inherited the land, people came not to laugh, but to walk. Families strolled along the hillside paths. Children who once threw stones now collected fallen leaves, marveling at their colors. The laughter had disappeared completely. In its place grew something quieter: respect. One afternoon, the mayor visited. He climbed slowly, wiping sweat from his brow as he reached the top. "I've received complaints," he said. My stomach tightened. "Complaints?" He smiled faintly. "People want to know if you'll help them plant trees too." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "They say the valley feels different," he continued. "Cooler, calmer. The wind isn't as harsh." I looked over the hillside at the countless young trees rising from old wounds, and felt a deep sense of connection to the land. The stumps that once symbolized loss had become foundations for renewal. "I'm still learning," I said carefully. The mayor nodded. "Then maybe the valley can learn with you." That night, standing beneath a sky filled with stars, I realized the hill was no longer silent. Leaves rustled softly together, creating a sound like distant waves. Life had returned, not because I forced it, but because I listened to what the land was trying to do all along. The valley had laughed when I arrived. Now they were watching with hope, and deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. Winter arrived quietly that year, covering the valley in pale frost and silver mist. The young trees on the hillside stood bare, their thin branches reaching toward the gray sky like hundreds of hopeful fingers. From a distance, the hill still looked rough and uneven, but anyone who had seen it months earlier knew it was no longer the same place. The stumps were no longer the most noticeable thing. Life was. The valley had grown strangely protective of the hillside. People who once laughed now walked carefully along its paths, avoiding the fragile young shoots. Children were told not to break branches. Farmers pointed toward the hill whenever visitors asked why the air seemed cooler, or why the river ran clearer after storms. Sometimes I would wake early before sunrise and stand near the top of the hill, looking down at the sleeping valley. Thin smoke rose from chimneys, drifting slowly through the cold morning air. The young forest around me rustled softly, even in winter, the roots beneath the soil still alive and working. I realized something then. The hillside was no longer just my inheritance. It had become the valley's future. Late in winter, a heavy storm rolled through the region. The clouds arrived like a dark wall, swallowing the sky and shaking the mountains with thunder. Rain fell harder than anything I had seen since moving there. By nightfall, the ground trembled under the force of the downpour. Storms like that had always terrified the valley. Before the trees returned, rain would rush down the bare hillside in violent waves of mud and water. Fields flooded. Roads washed out. The river turned thick and brown with soil ripped from the land. That night, the villagers watched the hill nervously. I stood outside my small cabin as the rain pounded the roof and lightning flashed across the sky. The wind roared through the young branches, bending them but not breaking them. For hours, the storm continued. But something remarkable happened. The hillside held. Instead of water racing downward, the rain soaked into the soil. The roots beneath the stumps gripped the earth tightly. Grass and growing trees slowed the runoff. Small streams trickled gently downhill, instead of raging like floods. When morning finally arrived, the valley looked different. The river was high but clear. Fields were wet but not destroyed. The road that usually washed out during storms remained intact. People walked outside cautiously, staring toward the hillside as sunlight broke through the clouds. For the first time in decades, the storm had passed without damaging the valley. That afternoon, a group of villagers climbed the hill together. Farmers, shop owners, children, even the mayor. They moved slowly through the young trees, looking around in quiet disbelief. Elias spoke first. "This hill used to send mud into my fields every spring," he said. "Last night, nothing came." Mrs. Haldon rested her hand against one of the stumps that had grown several tall branches. "I remember when this whole valley was forest," she said softly. "The storms were gentler then." The mayor turned to me. "You saved the valley without even realizing it." I shook my head. "The trees did." He looked across the hillside, where hundreds of young trees now stood, shoulder to shoulder with old stumps. "Will they keep growing?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And each year there will be more." Word spread beyond the valley after that storm. People from nearby towns began visiting to see the strange hillside, where trees had returned from stumps everyone believed were dead. Some brought notebooks and cameras. Others simply walked quietly through the growing forest, touching the bark as if confirming it was real. One spring morning, about 2 years after I inherited the land, a farmer from a neighboring valley arrived at my door. "Our hills were logged to," he explained. "All we have left are stumps like yours." He hesitated before asking the question, "Can they grow back?" I smiled because I had asked myself the same thing once. "Yes," I said, "if you give them a chance." Soon more people came with the same request. Farmers, communities, landowners who had once believed their forests were gone forever. They wanted to know how to help the stumps grow again. I didn't have complicated answers. Clear the choking weeds. Protect the young shoots. Let the roots breathe. Be patient. Most importantly, believe the land is stronger than it looks. Back on the hillside, the young trees were growing taller every season. Birds nested in their branches. Deer began wandering through the undergrowth at dusk. The soil grew darker and richer as fallen leaves slowly turned back into life. The valley itself felt different. Summers were cooler. Winds were softer. The river flowed steady even during dry months. Farmers began planting small tree lines along their fields after seeing what the hillside had done. The place that once looked like a graveyard had become the heart of a living forest. One evening near sunset, I climbed to the very top of the hill again, just as I had on my first day there. But the view was completely different now. Green stretched across the slope in every direction. The old gray stumps were still there, but they no longer looked broken. They looked like foundations, quiet reminders of what had come before and what had survived. Below, the valley glowed with warm evening light. Smoke rose gently from houses. Children played near the river. The whole place felt peaceful in a way I had never noticed before. Footsteps approached behind me. It was Elias. "The council had a meeting today," he said. He nodded toward the hillside. "They want to start replanting the rest of the valley. Tree belts along the river. Forest patches near the farms." I looked out at the horizon where distant hills rolled toward the fading sun. That's a big project. He smiled. They said you might help? For a moment, I didn't answer. I remembered the first day I stood here, surrounded by laughter and disbelief, holding nothing but a hillside of broken stumps. Now the valley was asking for trees, not mocking, not doubting, begging. I took a slow breath, listening to the wind move through the growing forest around us. Yes, I said finally. I'll help. Elias looked satisfied and started walking back down the path. Before leaving, he turned and said something that stayed with me long after he disappeared into the trees. You know, he said when you first arrived, everyone thought you inherited the worst land in the valley. He gestured toward the forest. Turns out, you inherited the most important one. The sun dipped below the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the hillside. Leaves rustled softly together, a sound like quiet applause from the forest itself. And standing there, among the living trees, I understood something simple but powerful. The valley had laughed when I inherited a hillside of stumps. Now they were begging me for trees,